Hey guys, today we are going to talk about two rhetorical strategies that come up in a lot of the prompts that AP chooses to give us for the rhetorical analysis essays. It doesn't always happen, but usually there is at least some kind of repetition or parallelism in the passages that they give us. So if you haven't yet, pause this video and open the document that I attached to this assignment. It's called 2004 prompt. I think it's called Chesterfield Rhetorical Analysis. So pull that up, read it carefully, and then come back to the video because we are not going to talk about every sentence in this and you'll need some context. Okay, so this is a letter written from a guy named Lord Chesterfield to his young son who is traveling far from home. I don't know really anything about Chesterfield as a writer, so I'm kind of in the same boat with you guys. What's nice is that this passage that they give us feels quite universal. Like it seems like maybe in fancier, older language, but it seems like a letter that fathers have been writing their sons for years. So this letter uses repetition quite often. We're going to focus on the first instance of repetition, which is this use of the phrase, I know. So you look at the beginning here and he says, I know how unwelcome advice generally is. I know that those who want it most like it and follow it least. And I know too that the advice of parents more particularly is ascribed to the moroseness and imperiousness or the garrulity of old age. So for general meaning there, he's basically saying that people don't like getting advice in general. Like nobody likes getting advice if they didn't ask for it. Then he says people who need that advice the most are going to be the most resistant to that advice. And then this last part is basically him saying, like, I know you kids are always saying, okay, boomer, but I'm old and I've got knowledge for you. Like he says that a lot of times when old people give advice, they're just like, ugh, you're old, you're cynical, you're depressed all the time, and you talk too much. So we really don't want to listen to you at all. So somehow, why would he bring this up, right, in a letter where he wants his son to follow his advice? Why would this guy start the letter by saying, like, I know how terrible advice is? And we get the answer to that when we're thinking about the repetition. So here are two mistakes that students generally make when they're writing about repetition. One, they say that the writer is repeating something in order to get the reader to remember it. Okay, there's two things wrong with that. The main thing is that it is not offering anything to the analysis of the argument. That's a general statement that could be true of any piece of text, right? If you say the author wants us to remember it, could you be saying that exact same thing about something that Martin Luther King wrote, for example? That's always one sort of quality of repetition. The second thing, though, is that it's not always the case. Like you look here and it's like, I know. Like, why would Chesterfield, out of all the things he says in his letter, why would he want his son to remember the phrase, I know, most of all? That's not the case, right? So just put the idea of repetition being for memory purposes out of your mind. Don't use the word remember or memory when you are writing about repetition. It's a boring way to talk about it anyway. And the second mistake, I feel like that was the first mistake. Yeah, the second mistake that students often make when they're talking about repetition is that they say it emphasizes. And then they just leave it at that. He repeats the phrase I know because it emphasizes maybe that he knows. Like I see a lot of tautologies, which is just like circular reasoning when people write about repetition. And yes, repetition does emphasize, but what you're trying to articulate is why and how it emphasizes and what it emphasizes, like to what end, what purpose is there for emphasizing here. So you can use the word emphasize. It's not like the word remember where I just don't even want you to use that word. You can use the word emphasize, but remember what you are trying to do is show why Chesterfield his rhetorical choices are going to be effective. So to do that with repetition, you think of a couple things. The first is you think about what is being repeated. You have to look at the specific words the same way you would when you were looking at tone or metaphor or anything like that. You want to look at the words that are being repeated. In this case, there's two. The first word repeated is I, which is an interesting choice. Lots of times when you guys write papers, your teachers will tell you that you are using personal pronouns too often. Don't use the word I in your paper. It makes you sound weaker, right? Like, because you're saying, instead of just saying advice is unwelcome, you are kind of like couching that in your own personal fallibility. Like, you're saying, I might be biased, but I think that advice is unwelcome, right? So it kind of like it kind of adds a layer of like uncertainty to your writing. What's interesting though is here, everything in this letter depends on his personal power. This is a letter where he gives advice, and it is not based on reasoning, and it's not based on evidence. It is just based on his ethos, his credibility, and his power over his son, right? And so he has to establish that ethos very early on. So the repetition of I is saying, I am important to this paper. I'm important to you. And I am a trustworthy resource. And then he uses the word know, and he doesn't use the word think or believe or anything like that. He says, I know. And what's interesting is that he's saying, I know my argument will not be well received, because he's claiming that I'm about to give you some advice. You should know that. And I know that you won't like it. But think of a way that also gives you some ethos, because here he is right at the beginning establishing the counter argument, saying, look, I understand your point of view. I know that you feel a certain way. But then he says, on the other hand, and then he moves on into his own argument. So the very first thing he does in his letter is say, I understand where you are coming from, son. But the word knowledge is better than the word understand, because knowledge is based in experience. And so he's saying, like, in my experience, I have seen how advice is not wanted, but it's this same experience that is going to allow me to give you good advice. So even though my experience tells me you're not going to like it, my experience tells me you are going to have to listen to it, basically. So the I know repeated that way emphasizes his own position in relation to his son. The other thing you want to look at with repetition is the placement of it. And that's where we get into this second rhetorical strategy you can think about, which is parallelism. Parallelism is the repetition of structure. So repetition is just repetition of words, and there are all sorts of Latin vocab terms associated with repetition, which I will post in a later activity today. But parallelism is like the repetition of the structure of the sentence, so that all of these start with I know, and then they talk about advice and the state of advice, right? So it's like, I know that unwelcome advice is, so it's like flipped, right? I know those who want it follow it, at least. And then I know advice of a parent is. So it's like certain kinds of advice followed by the verb tense. And that repeats 3 times. So that is called parallelism. Parallelism can be on the level of the sentence, like it is here, but you can also repeat certain orders in the level of the paragraph, which you will see in the prompt I'm giving you for today. But basically, if you start with one idea at the beginning of your paragraph and end with another, and you do that over and over again, then you have parallelism in ideas too, and in paragraph structure. And there's all sorts of parallelism. But the key with that one is thinking about structure, syntax, and not necessarily diction. So here you have a combination of both. And with parallelism, you want to think about the order that things are being presented. You can think about the order of the actual like parts of speech. It always goes noun, verb, object, or something like that. But here, I think what's important is the order of ideas. There's a bit of a funnel effect going on with that. He starts with advice generally. Look, everybody hates advice. Everybody doesn't want to hear from people that they didn't ask for advice from, right? And so it's kind of like stating like, hey kid, I know this is kind of making you mad when I do this, but you should know that everyone feels that way. Like, you're not alone in this. And then he goes down to a bit of an insult where he says, and those who want it like the people that need it the most. When it says want it the most, he's saying like they need it, like they're wanting of advice. Those who want it the most like it and follow it the least. So he's kind of saying like the more you resist my advice, the more that shows me that you are the one who needs my advice. And then at the end it goes even more specific, and he's like, and advice from parents to children is the most, like the hardest to swallow, the stuff that you guys hate the most. So he kind of like goes from like, this is the general situation to, hey kid, this is your exact situation. And since his experience follows each one, he's kind of showing how he has had personal experience with all three of those kinds of ways of thinking about advice. And that will set him up then for later on giving that specific advice, because he's already shown that he understands the context and the situation of his rhetoric. Okay. So what I'm hoping I demonstrated here is the way you think not just about the fact that repetition exists in this text. That's only a tiny little part of a rhetorical analysis, is identification. You've found the repetition, that's great. But what you need to think about now is what is being repeated and how it is being repeated for a rhetorical purpose. All right, what's nice about this passage is that there's all sorts of repetition that you can look at. He repeats the word flatter. He repeats do not. He repeats the word hint. And he repeats the word excel. And I want you to choose one of those repetitions to talk about. Some of them have parallelism attached, like the do not, or even the flatter actually is a parallel structure too. Others don't, like excel. And when you're thinking about the word excel, it's versions of excel. I think he used excelled or excellable, excelling he uses. So I just mean like sort of variations of the word excel. And I want you to, in 3 to 4 sentences, kind of do a very shortened version of what I just did here. Why is that word choice important? Why is it important to repeat it in the way that he does? As a bit of a side note, there is something that we studied in class that's kind of rare in this passage, which is called an apophasis. Do you remember apophasis? That's the one where it's such a parent move, that's why I'm kind of laughing, but it's like where you bring something up by saying that you're not going to bring it up. Like, I'm not even going to bring up the fact that you didn't do the dishes last week. And it's like, well, you just did. You really did bring that up. So you saying that you're not going to actually has an ironic effect. He does that in this passage in the funniest way. It's like, he's like, I'm not even going to bring up the fact that you're dependent on me for money because I know you're just going to follow my advice because you're a good kid, right? And it's like this shame that he like pours on his son. It's great. Okay, so yeah, the activity, I will post it again below, but just comment like 3 to 4 sentences on the repetition in this passage.